For as the light of the morning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, and covereth the whole earth, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Therefore sanctify yourselves, that your minds become single to God, and the days will come that you shall see him. For he will unveil his face unto you, and it shall be in his own time, and in his own way, and according to his own will. This is Unveiling Jesus Christ.
Hello, and welcome to this podcast on Unveiling Jesus Christ. I'm John Cassanet, and my last 6 podcasts have talked about Satan's increasing power in the political kingdoms of the world since ancient Babylon. As you have heard multiple times, his power will continue to increase until the future gathering of saints at Adam-ondi-Ahman, as recorded in Daniel chapter 7, where he also tells us exactly when this gathering will occur. So I've been telling you it will be 3.5 years before the second coming, and that's not just me taking a guesstimate. That's what Daniel tells us in Daniel chapter 7, verse 25, and that's what we'll be talking about today. For the nutshell version of this podcast, you can check out section 139 in my book that you can find on unveilingjesuschrist.com. By way of reminder, Daniel told us about the little horn of Satan's growing dominion in Daniel chapter 7, verse 8. That's what I spoke about in my last podcast. Now, today, Daniel 7:25 tells us that the little horn shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they, meaning the saints, shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of time. Close quote. I know that doesn't exactly and immediately sound like 3.5 years before the second coming, but that's why I'm devoting this podcast to talking about this verse and the timing mentioned in this verse. The time and times and the dividing of time is a commonly used prophetic phrase in this verse and others, which means 3.5, where time equals 1 year, times, plural, equals 2 years, and the dividing of time equals 1/2 year, for a total of 3.5 years. We find the same times, time, and dividing of time in Daniel 12:7 and again in Revelation 12:14. Warren Wiersbe makes the same observation about the 3.5 years that I have repeatedly repeated, saying, according to Daniel 7:25, 3.5 years is a significant period of time in the prophetic scriptures. It's stated as time, times, and halftime in Daniel 7:25 and in Revelation 12:14, 42 months in Revelation 11:2 and Revelation 13:5, and 1,260 days in Revelation 11:3 and Revelation 12:16. This period is half of the 7 years, another significant time span in prophecy. Close quote. The significant 7-year time frame just mentioned includes the period of the Second Woe, also known as Armageddon, that I've talked about in prior podcasts. Charles Ellicott further explains the time, times, and dividing of time, saying, this is frequently explained to mean 3.5 years. Those who adopt this explanation assume that by times a dual is implied, which in Chaldee is represented by the plural. They next assume that by a time is meant 1 year, resting their assumption partly on Daniel 4:16 and partly on a comparison of Daniel 12:7 with Revelation 13:5 and Revelation 11:2-3. This gives a sum of 3.5 years, which is interpreted either literally or explained to mean half a sabbatical period or half some divinely appointed period symbolized by the number 7. Close quote. Of course, 3.5 and 7 are both numerologically significant, as I discuss in my podcast from October 29 on 2023. We equate time times dividing of time to 3.5 years equals 42 months and equals 1,260 days based on the Hebrew calendar that has 30 days per month. Kyle and Dillich connect these dots in the following quote, saying, "This tyranny God's people will suffer till, or in other words, during a time, 2 times, and half a time. By these specifications of time, the duration of the last phase of world power is more definitely declared as a period in its whole course measured by God. The plural word times, standing between time and half a time, can only designate the simple plural, in other words, 2 times, used in the dual sense, since in the Chaldee the plural is often used to denote a pair where the dual is used in Hebrew. 3.5 times are half of 7 times. The greater number of the older as well as of the more recent interpreters take time as representing the space of a year, thus 3.5 times as 3.5 years. And they base this view partly on Daniel 4:13, where 7 times must mean 7 years, partly on Daniel 12:7, where the corresponding expression is found in Hebrew, partly on Revelation 13:5 and 11:2 through 3, where 42 months and 1,260 days are used interchangeably." Close quote. Now, in terms of what I have been saying about Satan's growth of power until the gathering of saints at Adam-ondi-Ahman, Matthew Henry, who is a non-LDS author and theologian, has said, "In these daring attempts, he," meaning Satan, "shall for a time prosper and have success. They," the saints, "shall be given into his hand until time, times, and a half a time, that is, for 3 years and a half, that famous prophetical measure of time which we meet with in the Revelation, which is sometimes called 42 months, sometimes 1,260 days, which come all to one. But at the end of that time, the judgment shall sit and take away his dominion, which he expounds of the beast being slain and his body destroyed." Close quote. Thus we see that the 3.5-year period identifies the set time for the future gathering of saints at Adam-ondi-Ahman described by Daniel in Daniel 7 verses 9 through 10, which says, "I beheld till the thrones were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit. Thousands ministered unto him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The judgment was set." Close quote. Bruce R. McConkie connects these verses to the gathering at Adam-ondi-Ahman, saying, "Daniel's account of the great Latter-day Council at Adam-ondi-Ahman includes these words, 'I beheld till the thrones were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit. The judgment was set, and the books were opened,'" quoting Daniel 7, verses 9 through 10, close quote. Gerald Lund also confirms the meaning of the words of Daniel, saying, "Daniel said that the great Ancient of Days would sit after earthly thrones were cast down. He went on to say that he beheld the horn making war against the saints until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom." Obviously, Satan still rules in the nations of the world in many respects, and so the Grand Council of Adam-ondi-Ahman seems to be one of the last events and one of the great signs of the times which is yet to be fulfilled. Close quote. In short, in a future day, all earthly thrones will be cast down, as stated in Daniel 7:9. This really has 2 meanings, where on the one hand, the power of Satan in political and earthly kingdoms will reach its climax, and he will begin to lose his grip on world power as Christ descends to his position as King of Kings. When this occurs, the power of earthly kings and the power of Satan within kingdoms will begin to descend and fall and be cast down. This is expressed by Joseph Fielding Smith, who said, "Daniel and John each saw the opposition the little horn made against the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This opposition will continue until the Grand Council is held at Adam-ondi-Ahman. This little horn is making a renewed and determined effort today to destroy the church. The Lord has decreed otherwise, and while its power will last until Michael comes and the Son of Man receives his rightful place, this great power will endure. It must, however, fall, and according to the Scriptures, its end will come rather suddenly." Close quote. So that's one meaning of what Daniel is telling us when he said that the thrones will be cast down. But it also has another meaning because, as I've mentioned before, the idea of thrones being cast down is actually a translation error. Is really kind of an understandable error given the big build-up to Adam-ondi-Ahman that various scriveners and translators were working with from the original. They're seeing in Daniel 7 where Satan's power in the political kingdoms continues to grow since the time of ancient Babylon, and when we finally get to Adam-ondi-Ahman, and in Hebrew, Daniel says the thrones were set up, but they're thinking, no, that can't be right. The earthly thrones have to be cast down. So that's why they translated it as thrones being cast down. But Daniel actually really did say that thrones would be set up at the time of Adam-ondi-Ahman, but it's not political. Everything in Daniel is focused on spiritual kingdoms. In other words, the power of Satan in political kingdoms only. So now the spiritual kingdom of the saints begins to be set up with the gathering of saints at Adam-ondi-Ahman still in our future. Donald W. Perry kind of explains all this, saying, Daniel 7:9, the thrones were cast down. A more correct reading of this phrase is, the thrones were set in place, or the thrones were set up. And he cites to a footnote in Daniel 7:9 in the LDS edition of the King James Version. In his vision, Daniel saw places of honor being set up in preparation for the great meeting to be held at Adam-ondi-Ahman. Thrones rather than chairs are set in place because exalted beings will be present. Close quote. To be a little bit more precise, we would actually say that thrones were set up for exaltation-worthy saints. Thus, we read in Daniel 7:18 that the saints of the Most High shall take the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. Close quote. As the power and dominion of the saints is set up, they will ascend to these thrones even as Satan's power and his dominion is cast down in what I refer to as the spiritual fall of modern Babylon. Now, I distinguish this spiritual fall that occurs at the time of Adam-ondi-Ahman 3.5 years before the second coming, and I distinguish that from the physical fall of modern Babylon that will actually occur at the time of the second coming. And I'll discuss this some more in future podcasts. Thus, we read in Daniel 26 concerning this spiritual kingdom and spiritual dominion that the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and to destroy it unto the end. Close quote. Notice that Daniel does not say in this verse that Satan's dominion is consumed and destroyed at that time. His power and dominion is consumed and destroyed to the end. Adam-ondi-Ahman is not the end. Satan falls spiritually. That is, he's kind of knocked off his spiritual high horse, but his physical kingdom, his earthly dominion, the wickedness in the world, and all of his followers will still exist until the second coming. Many commentators think that Adam-ondi-Ahman is the complete end of Satan's power. Now, Keil and Delitzsch, non-LDS scholars, got it almost right, saying in verses 26 and 27, this judgment is described, but only as to its consequences for the world power. The dominion of the horn, in which the power of the fourth beast culminates, is taken away and altogether annihilated. The destruction of the beast is here passed by, inasmuch as it is already mentioned in verse 11, while, on the other hand, that which is said in verse 12 about the taking away of its power and its dominion is strengthened by the infinitive to destroy and to consume, to the end, in other words, not absolutely, but as in Daniel 6:27, to the end of the days, in other words, forever, close quote. In other words, Keil and Delitzsch are saying that the power of Satan is destroyed with the Ancient of Days when he shows up at Adam-ondi-Ahman, and thereafter they continue to destroy and consume to the end, which they interpret as forever. But that's not really the way that it's going to work. Yes, his power will begin to be destroyed and consumed as of the gathering at Adam-ondi-Ahman, but the end comes at the second coming. That's when Satan's physical kingdom will fall, along with his spiritual kingdom that already begins to deteriorate at the time of Adam-ondi-Ahman. So what we essentially see with the combined visions of Daniel and John is that there is this 3.5-year prophecy associated with Adam-ondi-Ahman that corresponds in time with the midpoint of the 7-year battle of Armageddon. This conclusion is based primarily on the 70 weeks prophecy that we find recorded in Daniel 9, verses 24 through 27, the last verse of which says, quote, "He shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week." And he's referring here to a sabbatical week of years, just because I know this is a little bit new and something that I talked about in a prior podcast on November 26th of 2023. But if you haven't listened to that podcast or not listened to it recently, this all seems a little bit strange. So let me begin again with the quote. "He shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation. And that determined shall be poured out upon the desolate." Close quote. Now, as I mentioned, I go through this in great detail in my podcast from November 26th of 2023. But in short, the week referred to here is the 70th week of 7 years just before the second coming. That is, during the last 7 years before the second coming, which is the period of Armageddon, Jewish sacrifices in the temple at Jerusalem will cease at the midpoint. In other words, 3.5 years of the last 7 years, leading to the final abomination of desolation at the second coming. Richard Draper speaks of the type of abomination we're talking about here, saying, in the Bible, the term abomination describes those things so vile that they rouse the instant wrath of God. In their worst form, they are called the abomination of desolation and are associated with the corruption of the temple. Their presence in the temple causes God's Spirit to withdraw, leaving the sanctuary fully exposed to destruction. Close quote. And again, the temple that he's talking about here is the temple in Jerusalem. So essentially, what we learn from Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy is that during this final week, which corresponds to John's vision of Armageddon and is also known as the Second Woe in Revelation 9, 13 through 21. And you'll remember going back to my several podcasts, that these verses tell us that there were these four angels who symbolically arise from the Euphrates River, which is a euphemism for the bottomless pit. Then there are these horses and horsemen that have a trilogy of fire, jacinth, and brimstone. We have the armies of 200 million, and 1/3 of the wicked die as a class, meaning sons of perdition. Then there are the remaining unrepentant 2/3 who are celestial survivors who will die another day. If you're a James Bond fan, you might catch that reference. So John does not say how long Armageddon will last in Revelation chapter 9. But after he describes Armageddon in Revelation 9, his chronological narrative continues without interruption as he symbolically describes in Revelation 10 what Daniel describes in Daniel chapter 7. That is, when Adam, who is the Ancient of Days, comes to sit at Adam-ondi-Ahman in Missouri in Daniel chapter 7, verse 9. The correlation of these visions by Daniel and John, including Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy, lead to the inescapable conclusion that Armageddon is a 7-year battle of the second woe, broken at the midpoint by the gathering of saints at Adam-ondi-Ahman, when the third temple in Jerusalem will be desecrated. And I've talked about this third temple before. We have to actually construct it before it can then be desecrated 3.5 years before the second coming. So when we get to the midpoint of Armageddon, Satan will be at the height of his power and dominion. And remember how we started out in Revelation chapter 9 when we had the bottomless pit open and there were these evil spirits that emerge in this great spiritual darkness represented by smoke from a furnace. And from this smoke and this darkness, there's this swarm of locusts that emerge during the first woe for a period of 5 months. So that's a time of incredible power. This is part of what it means when we're talking about this little horn of Daniel. Then, as the second woe begins in Revelation chapter 9, Satan's power grows again, right up to the point of the midpoint of the war. And then, when we get to that midpoint, the midst of the 70th week of 7 years, the Lord essentially says, enough is enough. And boom, we have the gathering at Adam-ondi-Ahman, where Christ is coronated for his earthly reign that will actually begin at the time of the second coming. After the gathering at Adam-ondi-Ahman is described by John in Revelation 10, 1-7, he continues in Revelation 11, recording the events that occur next in order. That is, after the Ancient of Days sits at Adam-ondi-Ahman as described in Daniel 7:9. And so here are some other connections to the same events described by Dan and John. In Revelation 11:1-2, John measures the same temple at Jerusalem where Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy predicts that the Jewish sacrifices will cease 3.5 years before the second coming. In Revelation 11:1-2, John also measures this third temple in Jerusalem, which I've talked about before. And bear in mind, the first temple would have been the Temple of Solomon that was destroyed in 578 BC by Nebuchadnezzar. The second temple of Zerubbabel, or Herod, was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. So John is measuring a third temple symbolically to show how Jerusalem will be preserved against Gentile attacks during the last 3.5-year period before the second coming, which is the period called the Great Tribulation. John Walvoord refers to it as such, saying, a time, times, and halftime refer to the 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation, with a time meaning 1 year, times 2 years, and half a time 6 months. This equals the 1260 days in Revelation 12:6 and the 42 months in Revelation 11:2 and 13:5. Close quote. Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown makes the same connection to Dan's little horn of Satan's power, saying the little horn, in Daniel's view, is to be Antichrist, rising 3.5 years before Christ's second advent, having first overthrown 3 of the 10 contemporaneous kingdoms. Close quote. So the timing by Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown is slightly off. The little horn actually begins to emerge in the early 1800s and is contemporaneous with the restoration of the gospel. Thereafter, the little horn grows in power and dominion as the gospel grows in power and dominion until Satan reaches the height of his power at the time of Adam-ondi-Ahman, which again is 3.5 years before Christ's second advent, as stated by Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown. Now, in Revelation 11, John describes the ministry of 2 witnesses in Jerusalem during the 3.5-year period of the Great Tribulation, which is also called 1260 days and also called 42 months. But we will cover that in a future podcast, so I'm not going to go into detail here. But the 2 witnesses use the sealing power to preserve the holy city during the 3.5 years of Great Tribulation. This is one of the reasons why it's obvious that Satan's power is curtailed as of the gathering at Adam-ondi-Ahman. That's when the 3.5-year period of the Great Tribulation begins. It's also the time when the 2 witnesses begin their ministry and exercise the sealing power to protect Jerusalem. Oh, that means Satan does not have as much power as he once had, because if he continued to have the great power that he possessed leading up to Adam-ondi-Ahman, then certainly he would have the power to destroy Jerusalem and the Jews during the last 3.5 years before the second coming, but he can't do it because his power has been curtailed, including because of the ministry of the 2 witnesses. Now, given the proximity of the start of their call to the gathering at Adam-ondi-Ahman, I conclude that they will be called during the future gathering at Adam-ondi-Ahman, and then they will die 3.5 years later when their ministry is complete. How'd you like to be those guys? You get your call at Adam-ondi-Ahman and you automatically know, hey, I'm one of the 2 witnesses. Oh, well, I'm going to die 3.5 years from now. That's essentially kind of how it comes down. So when the 2 witnesses die in Jerusalem, the Gentiles will overrun the city and temple, and for 3.5 days, they will have the final abomination of desolation leading right up to the second coming, precisely as Daniel predicted in his 70 weeks prophecy. Monty Nyman explains the timing of these events also, saying, once again, there will be the abomination of desolation, which was predicted by Daniel. Will there once again be terrible destruction upon Jerusalem by invading armies? This will undoubtedly be the time when the 2 prophets, not young missionaries, but general authorities who hold the sealing power, will be killed, left to lie in the streets for 3.5 days, and then be resurrected. Immediately following this great tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, and other sources talk about the moon turning to blood, becoming as blood, bathed in blood, etc., and the stars shall fall from heaven or refuse to give their light. Close quote. In his description, Brother Nyman cited Daniel 9:27, which is part of the 70 weeks prophecy that I've been talking about. So allow me to quote that verse again. Hopefully this time with a little bit more background and understanding under our belt, it will begin to make sense. The verse says, "And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured out upon the desolate." Close quote. This is what the Savior spoke about on the Mount of Olives the night before his crucifixion, as recorded in Matthew 24:15, but clarified by Joseph Smith the prophet in his inspired translation of Joseph Smith Matthew, verse 12 and 32, saying, "When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet concerning the destruction of Jerusalem, then you shall stand in the holy place. Whoso readeth, let him understand. And again shall the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet be fulfilled." Close quote. Warren Wiersbe, a non-LDS author, got the doctrine exactly correct when he said, using the language of Daniel, Jesus called this the abomination of desolation. This signals the last half of the tribulation, a period that is known as the wrath of God. It will climax with the return of Jesus Christ to the earth and the defeat of Antichrist and his army. Jesus Christ will then establish his kingdom on earth. Daniel doesn't go into all the details that John shares in the book of Revelation, but he does assure us that the kingdom of Satan and his counterfeit Christ will be defeated and destroyed by Jesus Christ. Close quote. So now, hopefully you are all convinced, as I am, that the time and times and dividing of time for the gathering of Adam-ondi-Ahman will occur at the 3.5-year midpoint of Armageddon. If you're still unsure, this is also confirmed in Daniel 7, verses 9 and 10, and I've talked about these verses before, which states that the thrones will be cast down and the judgment will be set. Judgment at the time of Adam-ondi-Ahman is analogous to a criminal court of law which imposes a sentence that must still be executed and carried out without delay. Donald W. Perry explains this analogous situation, saying, "The judgment was set." The term judgment is a legal term used numerous times in the Mosaic legal code, which also means court, and some biblical translators prefer to translate this phrase as "a court was held." That's from the New Jerusalem Bible. Daniel used the term 3 times in this section, here and again in verses 22 and 26. This court is not an earthly court of law, but a spiritual forum or tribunal held by celestial beings together with righteous mortals. Close quote. Albert Barnes likewise explains this, saying, "The judgment was set." That is, all the arrangements for a solemn act of judgment were made, and the process of the judgment commenced. Close quote. We're here talking about the judgment at Adam-ondi-Ahman, and it's a little bit like the movie called The Fugitive, where you may recall that Dr. Richard Kimball was convicted for the murder of his wife, but of course he was innocent. It was this one-armed guy that did it. But in the last court scene, the judge announces his sentence, that essentially he's to be transported to a facility for incarceration where the sentence of death by lethal injection would ultimately be carried out. So the judgment in the case of The Fugitive was set in that last scene of the courtroom drama, and the sentence that was announced was death by lethal injection that would then have to follow. So it is with the power of Satan at the time of Adam-ondi-Ahman as foreseen by Daniel. The judgment is set, it is decreed, and it just needs to be carried out at the time of the second coming. John confirms this exactly in his corresponding vision of Adam-ondi-Ahman in Revelation 10:6, which says, "And swear by him that liveth forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that therein are, and the earth and the things that therein are, and the sea and the things which are therein, that there should be time no longer." Close quote. This is John saying that the mighty angel, who is Christ, declares judgment at Adam-ondi-Ahman, and with this declaration of the judgment sentence, it must be carried out without delay. In other words, we're not going to have time any longer. This announcement of judgment is repeated in Doctrine and Covenants, section 88, 110, saying, "Until the seventh angel shall sound his trump, and he shall stand forth upon the land and upon the sea, and swear in the name of him who sitteth upon the throne, that there shall be time no longer, and Satan shall be bound, that old serpent who is called the devil, and shall not be loose for the space of 1,000 years." Close quote. Are you beginning to see the similarity and the parallelism in the language between Doctrine and Covenants, section 88 that I just quoted, and what John said in Revelation 10:6? George Reynolds explains section 88, verse 110 in his commentary, saying, "John heard the message this angel in Revelation 10:6 had to deliver. It was there that there should be no more time now, that is, no more delay, but that as soon as the seventh angel begins to sound, the mystery of God shall be finished, as he hath declared to his servants the prophets." That is, his message was that the time has now come for the completion of the plan of salvation, God's mystery, by the establishment of the kingdom of God as promised through the holy prophets. Close quote. To summarize what we now know of Adam-ondi-Ahman, where the Savior declared, "There shall be time no longer," this means that at the time of the gathering at Adam-ondi-Ahman, modern Babylon will fall spiritually. Its judgment is also set for its physical fall, as the Lord speedily executes his judgment on the wicked 3.5 years later at the second coming. Bruce R. McConkie explains what John said in Revelation 10, 2 through 7. Again, we're talking here about Adam-ondi-Ahman and John's symbolic images about it, saying, "From the lips of the angel comes the great pronouncement, sworn with an oath in God's holy name, that the time of sorrow and wickedness and of the persecution and death of the saints is now fulfilled, that there shall be no more delay, that there shall be no more delay, not that time as such should end and eternity begin, for the millennial era is still ahead, but, as shown in D&C 88, 110, that Satan shall be bound, thus ending the time. It shall be no longer when persecution prevails." Close quote. Joseph Fielding McConkie elaborates further on this, saying, the phrase, "there should be time no longer," comes from Revelation 10:6. Both the Living New Testament translation and the Revised Standard Translation render it, quote, "there should be no more delay." Close that quote. And the Amplified translation records, "there should be no more waiting or delay." The idea here is not that time will cease, but rather that the righteous will have waited and implored the Lord long enough. Satan will be bound, and the time of persecution and evil will have ended. Close quote. Thus we see the direct correlation with John's description of Adam-ondi-Ahman in Revelation 10 and Daniel's vision of the same event in Daniel chapter 7, and Joseph Smith's vision of the same event in Doctrine and Covenants, section 88. From the three sources, we can conclude with certainty that judgment on Satan's kingdom announced at Adam-ondi-Ahman will be carried out, as the wicked slay the wicked during the second half of Armageddon, and plagues of the third woe will then cause modern Babylon to fall physically in a single day. John describes the final cleansing of the earth and physical fall of modern Babylon in Revelation chapters 17 through 19 that we will get to in due course. Daniel likewise described the final 3.5 years of the earth's physical and spiritual cleansing in Daniel chapter 7, verses 11 and 12, saying, "I beheld even till the beast was slain, and his body destroyed, and given to the burning flame." Close quote. The burning flame will occur during the third woe that John talks about in the book of Revelation and that I will talk about in due course. It's the same day of burning described in Malachi chapter 4, verse 1, saying, "For behold, the day cometh that shall burn as an oven, and all the proud, yea, and all that do wickedly shall be stubble. And the day that cometh shall burn them up, saith the Lord of hosts, that it shall leave them neither root nor branch." Close quote. Joseph Fielding McConkie also puts this in context for us, saying, "The second coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, known as the end of the world, and meaning the destruction of the wicked, will entail a cleansing of the earth by fire, a removal of sin and corruption and wickedness from its surface." Close quote. John adds to Daniel's imagery of the burning beast in Daniel 7:11 what we can read in Revelation 19:20, where John symbolically describes how the beast, who has as its spiritual head Cain, and the false prophet, who has as its spiritual head Judas Iscariot, and how the two will be cast alive into the lake of fire, representing outer darkness, with all disembodied spirit sons of perdition, never to be loosed again, saying, quote, "And the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet, that wrought miracles before him, with which he deceived them that had received the mark of the beast, and them that worshipped his image. These both were cast alive into a lake of fire burning with brimstone." Close quote. Now, do you begin to see why we equate Cain as the spiritual head of the beast and Judas Iscariot as the spiritual head of the false prophet? Because both are cast alive into a lake of fire burning with brimstone. These are disembodied spirits capable of being cast alive into a lake of fire. If the beast and false prophet were merely an institution, a school, a false church, something that is not alive, then they could not be cast alive into a lake of fire burning with brimstone. And so what we have are Cain and Judas Iscariot as spiritual heads of a whole bunch of other disembodied spirits who are likewise living spirits who can be cast alive into a lake of fire burning with brimstone. So again, these pieces start to come together and become clearer once they start to kind of grow into your system a little bit. So that brings us to the end of another podcast that really ties up a lot of these loose ends concerning Satan's power in the last days as symbolized by the little horn. It connects the judgment on Satan's dominion at Adam-ondi-Ahman as described by Daniel with most everything that John has to say on the subject in the book of Revelation. So where does this leave us? We've covered the when, where, and most of the what concerning Adam-ondi-Ahman, but we still have the who, what, why, and how of Adam-ondi-Ahman to go, which I will begin to do in my next podcast in more detail. So until then, thanks for watching, listening, sharing, and subscribing, and to Jen and Kristen for all your technical help. I will see you next time on Unveiling Jesus Christ for a continuing discussion of Adam-ondi-Ahman.